this evening. And I thought what I would do tonight is we're approaching the 1-year commemoration of the events in Gaza between December 27th and January 18th. And I thought I would use this occasion to review what the record shows on what actually happened in Gaza, because a lot of material came out in the past year, both in the form of human rights reports and also in the form of various testimonies, mostly by Israeli soldiers, but also other testimonies in the course of the Goldstone mission's reportage on Gaza. So I wanted to first look at what happened in Gaza, because I'm afraid the history is going to be rapidly rewritten. In fact, it's already being rewritten. And then secondly, look at the Goldstone report, which seems to be the major repercussion of the Gaza events, and to try to figure out what is the significance of the report. And since this is mostly an activist audience, what we can learn from the Goldstone report in terms of how we should proceed in the future on trying to resolve the conflict. So let me begin by going through what happened in Gaza. For those of you who have clear memories, you'll forgive me for going over old ground. And for those of you whose memories are clouded, I think it's useful to try to recall the sequence of events. In January 2006, there were elections, parliamentary elections held in occupied territories. Hamas won the elections in what Jimmy Carter called a completely honest and fair election. The immediate reaction of the United States and Israel was to impose economic sanctions on Hamas. In 2007, in June 2007, the United States, Israel, and elements of the Palestinian Authority attempted a coup against the elected government in Gaza. The coup was foiled by the Hamas leadership, and the Palestinian Authority elements were forced to retreat into the West Bank. When the coup was foiled by Hamas, the immediate reaction of the United States and Israel was to tighten the blockade on Gaza, which Amnesty International called a flagrant violation of international law. Richard Goldstone, in the report under his name, he called the blockade a possible crime against humanity. At the time of the blockade, or even before the blockade was tightened, the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson, she journeyed to Gaza, and she said at the time that Gaza's whole civilization has been destroyed. I'm not exaggerating. In June 2008, Hamas and Israel entered into a ceasefire, and there was a quid pro quo with a ceasefire. On the Palestinian side, they were supposed to cease rocket attacks against Israel, and the Israeli side, they were supposed to gradually lift the blockade of Gaza. The Palestinians, as far as one can tell, honored their side of the ceasefire. The Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs put out a publication in which they wrote that Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire. On the other side, Israel did not fulfill its obligation to gradually lift the economic blockade of Gaza. In November 2008, Israel was now ready to launch its attack on Gaza, an attack which it had planned at least from March 2007. It needed a pretext. It didn't have at that point a pretext. And so November 4th, 2008, as the results of the U.S. presidential election were coming in, and all of the media were riveted to the results of those elections, Israel launched a deadly raid into Gaza, in effect ending the ceasefire. Amnesty International, in its annual report for 2008, it wrote, "A ceasefire agreed in June between Israel and Palestinian armed groups in Gaza held for 4.5 months, but broke down after Israeli forces killed 6 Palestinian militants in airstrikes and other attacks on 4 November 2008. Even though the ceasefire broke down, Hamas until the last week in December expressed a willingness to renew the ceasefire insofar as Israel was willing to lift that blockade of Gaza, the blockade which was a flagrant violation of international law, which was destroying the civilization. Sarah Roy, the Harvard-trained economist, she wrote in December, just on the eve of the Israeli attack, she said, "The breakdown of an entire society is happening in front of us, but there is little international response beyond UN warnings which are ignored." Hamas, as I said, expressed a willingness to renew the ceasefire and, in fact, to even expand the terms of the ceasefire. Israel refused. It demanded an unconditional and unilateral Hamas cessation of rocket fire. And then when Hamas refused those terms, the unconditional and unilateral ceasefire, Israel attacked on December 27th. I would mention in passing that some people are fairly quick to criticize Hamas for refusing to cease the rocket attacks, and the criticism is made both on moral legal grounds and also on tactical grounds. The moral legal grounds are that the Hamas rocket attacks were illegal under international law because they either targeted civilians or they were indiscriminate attacks on Israel. And then the tactical criticism of Hamas is that it gave Israel the pretext it wanted to launch the attack. In my opinion, neither of those criticisms are valid. I don't think that the Palestinians had any obligation to lay down and die. I don't think any tenet of international law imposes that obligation on Palestinians. When you say that they shouldn't have fired the rockets on either moral legal grounds or on tactical grounds, you have to present an alternative. A civilization is being destroyed. A flagrant violation of international law has been imposed on the people of Gaza. Sarah Roy wrote, to quote her again, "The breakdown of an entire society is happening in front of us." You have to present, in my opinion, an alternative. What else could Hamas have done under those circumstances? And unless you can present an alternative, another option, it doesn't seem to me that any criticism or that criticism of Hamas is valid. I would also want to point out, for what it's worth, because people often say if the Palestinians only had a Gandhi. The problem with people who make that kind of claim is they have not a clue what Gandhi actually wrote on these subjects. Gandhi was very clear on the fact, as he put it, that there are certain kinds of violence when, if they're resorted to against an overwhelming force, in his view, they're not violence. So, for example, he gave the cases